good afternoon, commissioners. So as you are well aware, addressing the homelessness crisis in the city requires a variety of approaches from different perspectives. In previous presentations, this board and the Housing Commission staff have discussed the need for multiple housing options that address specific needs of different individuals and families experiencing homelessness. As we've said many times, one size does not fit all. The importance of ongoing and additional funding to support housing programs for shelters and permanent supportive housing is also obvious. In addition, case management and supportive services are essential to help individuals and families successfully transition from the streets into different housing options and ultimately achieve housing stability. The combination of funding, housing, services is the key to making a difference in homelessness. The outreach workers, the case managers, housing specialists, housing navigators, behavioral health specialists, and so many others who work on the front line are really the linchpins that make the crisis response system viable. However, as we've discussed today, recruiting and retaining qualified people for these positions has become more and more challenging. The system cannot operate efficiently unless enough qualified employees fill these positions and importantly, remain in them long-term. So it would be simple to say that only more money is needed to be able to increase the pay for these essential workers. And that is absolutely true, but it is just part of the issue. You're going to hear this morning about job satisfaction, burnout, and the impact that working with a population that so often has experienced tremendous trauma can have on the frontline staff that we rely upon. They work in a challenging environment every single day. While the system should continually be evaluated, updated, discussed, improved, it's important that these reviews and comments about them distinguish between the structures involved and the people working in them day in and day out. Acknowledging them for the work that they do will help with the job satisfaction and morale as they continue to come face to face with those daily struggles of individuals, families, children experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to now ask Lisa to begin our presentation about those challenges that the homeless sector is experiencing locally related to staffing. And she'll also talk about some of the initiatives that the Housing Commission has been undertaking in order to mitigate those challenges. Lisa?
There we go. Next slide, please. As Jeff mentioned in his opening remarks, today we'll be discussing a challenging subject, the impact of workforce shortages on local efforts to address homelessness. But we will also be discussing efforts underway to continue to try to strengthen and build system capacity, despite what are not just local, but national challenges in attaining and retaining staff who work in community care and social services sectors. After the City of San Diego's bridge shelters launched in winter of 2017, the Housing Commission contracted with an industry consultant to conduct a review and analysis of the new program model. The consultant looked for alignment with best practices, but also at where the model needed refinement or further investment to support progress towards goals. The assessment determined that 21 case management positions and 9 housing specialist positions needed to be added across the 3 bridge shelters at that time. At the same time, the Housing Commission conducted an in-house assessment of these position types across our region and benchmarked salary ranges for both case management and housing specialist positions. Though the recommendations also included the elimination of 18 pre-existing positions, lower level positions that were more aimed at housing navigation only, the net increase to the budget across all 3 shelters was over $900,000. In 2019, during regular leadership meetings with providers, a common theme became the inability to identify skilled and knowledgeable candidates in frontline positions, as well as higher level positions for which candidates would have bachelor's or master's degrees in social work. It was equally challenging to find candidates with any understanding or experience of working with populations experiencing homelessness, or with navigating the variety of regional resources available to help serve people needing community care resources and housing opportunities. This affects the ability to grow programs and increase positive program outcomes, and increases pressure on existing staff with high caseloads and long hours, potentially resulting in low morale, compassion fatigue, and staff turnover. In February 2019, the Housing Commission began reporting on efforts to recruit staff into the new additional positions in the bridge shelters that had been approved by the board and housing authority 6 months earlier. At that time, in February 2019, 7 of the 30 positions had been filled. Today, we track 48 budgeted positions across the 3 bridge shelter programs. They represent supervising case managers, employment specialists, benefit specialists, and housing specialists. Of those 48 positions, 29 are filled, a 40% vacancy rate. Generally, these challenges have been attributed to a combination of factors, including environments such as street-based outreach and shelter program sites not being a preferred work environment for everyone. In May of 2019, the Housing Commission reached out to San Diego City College in an effort to increase interest in this sector as a career, develop a more skilled and prepared workforce across frontline positions, and potentially create a pipeline of skill levels to better meet the system's needs. The result of this collaboration is the Homelessness Peer Program the board heard earlier today. A number of students who have taken the class over the past 2 years were already working in the homelessness services sector. This is another intent of the class, to strengthen the existing workforce in addition to attracting a new workforce. The goal is to reduce staff turnover and give better support and training to staff to be successful. San Diego City's college's courses are cost-effective and accessible to a wide range of students, including those with past lived experience who may want to work in the sector to support others whose experiences may be similar to theirs. Next slide. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, staffing challenges increased. Conversations between the Housing Commission, the City of San Diego, the County of San Diego, and the Regional Task Force on Homelessness resulted in the launch of Operation Shelter to Home at the San Diego Convention Center. This initiative was an intentional response to increased system and staffing capacity by leveraging Housing Commission, City, County, and Convention Center staff to help support providers serving existing shelter residents, to increase shelter beds, and to provide access to public health and behavioral health supports for people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. In 2021 and into this year, new workforce challenges occurred nationwide through what has been dubbed the mass resignation, which I will discuss more on the next slide. After years of challenges in the community health and social work sectors, 2 years of high-intensity work situations for frontline staff have had significant impacts on the homelessness sector, with increasing challenges to recruit and maintain skilled staff. Housing Commission actions in recent years to help address some of these issues include right-sizing several legacy programs. These are programs that receive funding from fixed funding sources, such as Community Block Grant Funds, or CDBG, Emergency Solutions Grant Funds, ESG, or Continuum of Care, COC funds. The majority of the legacy programs had not seen any budget increases, even to keep pace with cost of living, since their inception. Some of these programs had been in operation since before 2010. Through additional city affordable housing funds, Alpha Project Family Shelter received a funding increase of approximately $300,000 in 2019 to right-size staff compensation and increase staffing positions that provide direct client services. As noted in an earlier presentation today, over the past 2 years, Housing Commission and city staff have worked with PATH to right-size the Legacy Connections Housing Interim Shelter Program, increasing compensation and staffing positions. The actions the board took today support the Housing Commission's and the city's efforts to add 15 additional beds and continue to right-size existing contracted beds for that program. Another legacy program, Father Joe's Village's interim shelter, which will be presented to the board for renewal next month, has also seen budget adjustments to help right-size caseloads and funding. Next slide. Workforce challenges are occurring locally, regionally, statewide, and across the country. In a housing market as competitive as San Diego's, challenges include attracting a skilled workforce, maintaining it locally, and not losing skilled staff to lower cost jurisdictions. The Workforce Report Card, a brief published by the National Association of Social Workers in November 2015, projected a shortage of nearly 200,000 social work positions nationwide by 2030, and an anticipated shortage of over 33,000 positions in California alone. Much has changed since this brief was published, but the projections are significant. In addition, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2021, over 47 million Americans voluntarily quit their jobs. Researchers continue to explore the reasons for these significant numbers, and many have re-entered the workforce, but not necessarily in the same sectors. A recent Pew Research Center survey also determined that of the workers surveyed, 63% of those who quit a job in 2021 cited low pay as a reason. 63% said they had no opportunities for advancement, and 57% said feeling disrespected at work was a reason they quit. The survey further identified that some 53% of employed adults who quit a job in 2021 said they have changed their field of work or occupation at some point in the past year. Workers younger than age 30 and those without a postgraduate degree are especially likely to say they have made this type of change. In a recent commentary published online by the Voice of San Diego, Akila Templeton of Veterans Village of San Diego, Bob McElroy of Alpha Project, Deacon Jim Vargas of Father Joe's Villages, and Hanan Scrapper of PATH wrote of similar concerns in our local sector. They said frontline staff are often being driven by a passion for social change and helping others, yet these staff working in some of the hardest jobs our city has to offer are often paid low wages. Further, Hanan Scrapper shared that PATH's interim housing staff participated in a critical incident stress debrief group facilitated by a doctoral level licensed clinical supervisor. The clinician found that the group's experiences largely resembled those of first responders, such as disaster workers, healthcare workers, social workers, and other high-risk occupations. These homelessness service sector leaders shared that as we approach the 2-year mark of the pandemic, critical services staff are burning out more than ever before, leaving behind the positions they once loved for less meaningful work that better pays the bills. Staff who stay on are being stretched thinner and thinner, unable to fully operate at the capacity that the pandemic, our neighbors in need, and our city expect of them. The Harvard Business Review recently published an article and findings about the deeper complexities of the worker shortages. Their analysis articulated that though record numbers of workers did quit their jobs in 2021, what we are living through is in fact not just short-term turbulence provoked by the pandemic. It is a continuation of a long-term trend of rising quit rates that began more than a decade ago. Their research identified 5 factors in this trend: retirement, relocation, reconsideration, reshuffling, and reluctance. For today's purposes, we'll focus on retirement, reconsideration, and reshuffling. The Harvard Business Review offered that in regard to retirement, in 2021, older workers left their jobs at an accelerated rate, and they did so at younger ages. They referred to reconsideration as the many deaths and instances of serious illness brought about by the pandemic. This caused people to reconsider the role of work in their lives, and that shift in perspective likely motivated some workers to quit, especially those who were burning out in demanding jobs. That burnout has occurred notably among frontline workers. Reshuffling was described in the article as changing types of jobs. Spikes in turnover hit industries with lower wage workers particularly hard. The article noted that there is evidence that many are reshuffling or moving among different jobs in the same sector or leaving the sector altogether for another. It is worth noting that this type of workforce churn has particularly negative impacts in areas of community care or social work, like our homelessness services sector. As the commentary in Voice of San Diego noted, much of the power of their work hinges on staff building trusting, supportive relationships with clients, and that process is interrupted when a high level of staff turnover occurs, which can result in clients feeling discouraged with having to start all over again with new staff. Next slide. An article in the May-June 2019 issue of Social Work Today pointed to a special issue of the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, which focused on behavioral health human resources. It noted that at least 44 million adults in the United States experience a diagnosable mental illness. The Social Work Today article further stated that the need for social work and behavioral health resources is growing faster than capacity. It specifically identified that the opioid epidemic and geriatric care needs of an aging general population were causing increasing pressures. Both areas that we are seeing have impacts in our local region generally and in our homelessness services sector work especially. The authors noted that peer and community health workers will be critical additions to behavioral health services positions, not to replace mental health workers, but to work alongside them and increase bandwidth. We have certainly seen the value of these positions in the homelessness services sector workforce, but increasing demand for these types of positions in the behavioral health workforce may result in increased competition for this more entry-level and critical staff positions. A National Library of Medicine survey from the first wave of the pandemic detailed that over a quarter, 26% of social workers served met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and 16% reported severe grief symptoms. While more than 99% of the sample reported average to high compassion satisfaction in those early months of the pandemic, over 63% reported average burnout, and nearly half reported average secondary trauma. What we take away from this is that our homelessness sector workforce, whether trained social workers, entry-level outreach staff, or residential shelter staff, need more support. And the service providers alone can't fill that need, particularly with limited and restricted funding. As we discuss these challenges locally, state-level advocates and policymakers are expressing similar concerns. A Cal Matters article in January of this year quoted Farah McDade Ting, a senior legislative representative with the California Association of Counties, who said, "We have all this money. Can we really do this if we don't have the people?" But research and briefs on this issue, both regionally and at state and national levels, have identified that compensation alone cannot solve the problem, though it is a critical component. Other components such as available and effective training, feelings of support and appreciation, opportunity for advancement, and a culture of security and value at work also are key. Of note, the San Diego County Behavioral Health Services Department, in collaboration with the San Diego Workforce Partnership, has been digging into the issue of social work and behavioral health workforce needs. It is anticipated that in the next few weeks, a white paper will be released detailing findings and recommendations to address some of the challenges we've discussed today. Housing Commission staff look forward to this pending analysis and how we may be able to align our own efforts with those potential recommendations. Next slide. Let's look in more depth at our own homelessness sector workforce challenges. Our administrative team that oversees both Housing Commission and city-funded contracts looks at vacancy rates in our system on a monthly basis. We look at shelter, outreach, services such as storage and day services, and other programs, including rapid rehousing. Across our shelter and outreach programs, as of March 31st, there is a 25% vacancy rate. There is a 6% vacancy rate in day services programs and a 22% vacancy rate across rapid rehousing programs, as mentioned earlier today. Notably, the highest percentage of staff vacancies, with a vacancy rate of 35%, is in direct services positions in the shelters. These include case managers, housing specialists, and residential coordinators. Next slide. Looking ahead and discussing current efforts, we want to frame them within the context of the Community Action Plan on Homelessness for the City of San Diego. Though the efforts to build capacity in 2018 and 2019, including the Homelessness Peer Program, began prior to the action plan's acceptance at City Council, those efforts, as well as our current initiatives, align with the foundational strategies of the action plan: to implement a systems-level approach, to create a client-centered homelessness assistance system, and to improve the performance of the existing system. Next slide. As we look to strengthen existing workforce and build capacity, we want to implement initiatives that are informed by the voices and experiences of frontline staff and provider leadership. The Housing Commission has held regular meetings with provider leaders in the past years. However, more recently, COVID focused attention into very specific areas, such as maintaining safe operations and piloting targeted new initiatives. The Homelessness Response Center focuses on system-level efforts to connect people to appropriate shelter resources, leveraging on-site resources with street-based case management, and progressing people to housing more quickly by monitoring barriers and resolving issues for case managers and housing providers. As part of launching the Homelessness Response Center, we re-implemented meetings with provider leadership as advisory group meetings and launched a new frontline staff advisory group in summer 2021. Housing Commission staff meet monthly with each group, working with them to identify critical topics of focus for future agendas and to gather input on key areas of interest or need. I would like to take a moment to thank provider leadership for their willingness to allow Housing Commission staff to meet directly with their frontline staff representatives. I especially thank the frontline staff advisory group members for providing such valuable input and having candid conversations with us on the challenges of the work, but also the creative ways they and their agencies take care of themselves and their peers, and for the great compassion and caring they show in their daily efforts. Both these advisory groups have provided input and recommendations on the ongoing development of the Homelessness Peer Program, on the compensation study that the Housing Commission has contracted with a third-party consultant to conduct, which I will be discussing in just a minute, and on the wellness and staff support initiative we are working collectively to implement. All of these are complementary efforts to shore up existing programs and build staffing and system capacity. Next slide. As the board just approved the continuance of the PEER program, we'll not go into too much detail here. However, I will note that PEER is an early and core component of our efforts to respond to challenges shared by providers and help create a pipeline of current PEER students and PEER alumni. The alumni that will potentially go on to undergraduate and graduate work to follow a career path into the homelessness services sector. This is a sector that we also want to help ensure can support their career growth, provide competitive wages, and demonstrate appreciation and value of their commitment. This slide also notes a new component of the program to be launched, which we thank the Leadership Advisory Group for reinforcing. It was the intention pre-COVID to do site visits and consider job shadowing opportunities in the field for PEER students. The Provider Advisory Group recently provided feedback that this would be a strongly encouraged and supported by the agencies as it gives students that critical on-the-ground feel for the work and the work environments. Next slide. The Housing Commission has contracted with a third-party consultant for a compensation analysis of our regional homelessness services sector. The consultant will conduct a comparison of average market compensation levels in the homelessness support services sector to other geographies, as well as other key positions in adjacent sectors and crisis response positions. The goal of the study is to re-benchmark key frontline and case management level positions with the intention of being more effective in attracting and retaining staff, reducing system vacancies, and increasing system performance. This re-benchmarking of key frontline and direct services positions will also by default adjust upward other high-intensive supervisory and middle management positions. A further key goal of the compensation study is around policy advocacy. Despite all of our efforts of the past several years to begin to right-size legacy programs and bring new programs on at higher staffing compensation, the sector as a whole continues to fall behind. The Housing Commission and city efforts alone to look at re-benchmarking compensation will not be enough. All funders, whether philanthropic, local government, state, or federal, will need to align funding across contracted programs to elevate compensation. One of the reasons for this is that nonprofit agencies also have to make sure from a human resources and employment standpoint that there are not wide ranges of compensation in similar positions across their programs with different funding sources. For service providers to increase wages across key positions, they need staff funding levels for all contracted programs to align across the different funding entities. A comprehensive third-party compensation study will support the Housing Commission, the city, and our policymakers in advocating for commensurate funding across funding entities. At a state level, there is more funding for homelessness efforts than ever before, but we need to be able to advocate that funding for existing programs to right-size them and reduce staff turnover is just as important as funding for new programming and is also cost efficient. This must be considered for our local and federal funding sources as well. Next slide. The compensation study takes a two-phase approach. For phase one, we anticipate receiving a draft report within the next week. This is the accelerated phase, searching market compensation databases for 16 identified key positions across 23 geographies, including high cost of living rental markets in particular. The analysis will compare median total compensation as a percentage of the average cost of living across the geographic locations. It will also compare existing gaps of compensation for individual positions to cost of living levels. The comparison of homelessness and housing sector compensation to average compensation in other sectors and targeted crisis response positions is also part of this phase. The outcome of phase one will be an initial benchmarking of key positions throughout the sector and scaled recommendations to remain competitive over time, not just within our sector, but to adjacent sectors as well. The Housing Commission is working with LaSar Consulting and Moss Adams Consulting for this effort. Next slide. Next, we will leverage the phase one analysis to identify targeted areas of focus for phase two. Phase two will also include targeted outreach to peer organizations to collect additional information. This will include non-cash compensation benefits and development of a staff survey and analysis of existing available data, analysis of ancillary and non-traditional benefits, and employment resources. It will also leverage the feedback received from a staff survey that is currently under development through our wellness initiative, which we will cover on following slides. Anticipated outcomes of phase 2 are final benchmarking of key positions throughout the sector, establishing pay ranges per key position types, and extrapolating across main positions at supervisory and middle management levels. This phase also will include identification of opportunities to enhance workforce morale and retention through non-traditional benefits, employment resources, and providing final reports and analysis to support future years' budgeting and policy advocacy efforts. Next slide. As Housing Commission staff met with the frontline and provider leadership advisory groups over the past year, we have had repeated conversations around burnout, health and wellness, and what is often referred to as self-care. Our partnership with Professor Makapoye and Professor Cosio at San Diego City College School of Social Work has helped inform and support the concept of a wellness initiative for the homelessness services sector to further efforts to support the industry in strengthening and retaining a workforce. We also wanted to ensure that our partners in the peer program at City College had the opportunity to hear the feedback and challenges that staff were experiencing so that the peer curriculum could incorporate these conversations and potential ways to relieve workplace stress into the coursework. On several occasions, the two advisory groups were joined by Professor Karen Makapoye as well. She has helped us frame the conversations around wellness and assisted in eliciting initial feedback that helps the Housing Commission, with the input of the Frontline Advisory Group, to develop a survey for frontline staff. The intent of the survey is to better inform the Commission and provider leadership about the staff needs and challenges locally and what types of responses and resources could strengthen staff's level of workplace enjoyment and engagement, personal wellness, and stress reduction. With feedback and support from the provider leadership group, we anticipate launching the survey in the coming weeks. The Housing Commission has also invested in recruiting for a human and social services intern to support development of the Wellness and Support Resources Initiative. We hope to include a web-based platform providing information on wellness and self-care resources. In addition, we are exploring a potential program that facilitates and leverages existing clinical social work staff within the provider network to provide peer support opportunities, such as virtual drop-in sessions for peer-to-peer connection and discussion of effective wellness tools. We will also be considering the feasibility of leveraging community resources and/or contracting for trainings and other resources to support wellness activities. Provider leadership have also discussed pulling together functions as simple as networking or lunch opportunities across agencies to develop a stronger peer-to-peer support system and to build relationships not just among individual agency staff, but across the sector's provider network. A few final comments before we close. You'll note that we use the term self-care very sparingly and instead focus the narrative around wellness and support resources. Over the past two provider meetings, there has been continued discussion about how critical messaging and communication is, both internally and in the broader community. We have even discussed creating a lexicon of shared terminology around wellness and support resources. It was pointed out in a recent meeting that the term self-care implies that the individual is solely responsible for it. One CEO commented that when this term is used in regard to maintaining wellness in the workplace, it puts the full burden on the individual rather than creating a shared responsibility. It was discussed that as leaders, we must take ownership of the needs of staff, particularly those who are in crisis response exposure positions. So we have intentionally been moving away from that language. As we move forward in these efforts to stabilize and build the workforce, the impact of both negative and positive communication cannot be emphasized enough. The Cal Matters article commented on this specifically, as did the recent provider article in the Voice of San Diego. When staff are experiencing increased work pressures, when compensation is insufficient, when the main reason that staff stay is because they are driven to the work through passion and compassion, the words they hear from the public and policymakers matter. As we look to improve workplace supports and increase compensation, we must also increase community awareness by elevating and highlighting the workforce in ways that are more effective. as we highlight the courageous families and individuals that transition back into stable housing despite often challenging barriers, we must also do better at highlighting their partners in that journey, the dedicated and underacknowledged frontline staff that help support them in that journey, that help navigate them through those challenges to find their way home. Finally, it is important for us to acknowledge that there is no simple solution to this issue. Our local efforts continue to endeavor to mitigate these system stressors, to support the homelessness services system, and bear results. But this is a complex challenge with many contributing factors. These are factors that go well beyond the homelessness services sector and are systemic in nature as they intersect with behavioral health, community care work, and even primary health sectors. The solutions will also be complex. But what is clear is that alignment across funding entities and high-level policy action at state and federal levels will be some of the components necessary to affect long-term systemic change. Leveraging these different approaches and others yet to be identified and strengthening the system through collective impact and alignment, both locally and more broadly, must be the way forward. Next slide. That concludes the presentation. We thank you so much for the extra time today, and we're available for any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Do we have any callers on this item?
We do not have any callers on this item.
Thank you. Commissioner comments or questions? Commissioner Mitchell, you're off mute. Anything you'd like to add?
I just say thanks, Lisa, for the information. And I read the report, the presentation that you had when Scott sent it to us. Obviously, we've had this discussion about staffing shortages with the county as well. I mean, I know the counties had to change their pay scale for what they're offering, and they still continue to lose people to Riverside County and Orange County. And I think that between the challenges on what we're paying, the difficulty of the work itself, and just a tough cost of living environment, it does make this a difficult discussion, but it's one that I'm glad you're focused on and we're looking at. And I think what I took out of this is you really are looking at all the facets, and how we address them is going to really make a difference in how well our structure, how strong our structure is going forward in a very difficult topic. But so I appreciated that the insight. The legacy that you made a comment in the report about, we'd never really, I guess the phrase, right-sized the contracts with some of the providers, and they were, so the increases that you're now talking about, that was a little bit of a shock to me. And can you give me a little more insight at just why why they were so behind?
And so it's really been more recently that there's been other funding opportunities. The CDBG, the ESG, and the Continuum of Care funded programs are essentially fixed, except for very, very small adjustments sometimes in the COC. But the Continuum of Care oftentimes only adjusts the rental assistance and not the admin funds or the staffing funds to run the programs. So it becomes more and more out of alignment, frankly. And because of that, without having other funding sources come into the system, we don't have the ability to right size because the funding is fixed. We did some work in that through AHF funds, as I said, for the Alpha Family Shelter in 2018. We've done some work with that recently with PATH over the last 2 years, and with support of the city, really looking at how the new funding that's coming through in some of their programs, including general fund, there will be some right sizing with the Father Joe's interim shelter as well. But those are programs that really needed attention, to your point. And until more recently, where we've had more funding come in, we've been challenged to be able to right size those.
Yeah, I just I think it's important that we, as a commission, when we see these things happening and that the adjustments are happening, but they're not happening on the people side. It's the people that run the programs and oversee the programs. And it's so I guess what I would ask, Lisa, is that going forward, when we see this situation, that we're told at the commission level, and that we think about a strategy and a plan, because you will ultimately, the great resignation that is happening. I mean, most of the studies say that a lot of people are looking for better pay, and not just balance. Culture matters, And so I think what we have to think about is part of culture is are you taking good care of the people that are doing this difficult job for you? And are you ignoring the plight that, hey, I'm not getting any adjustments, but my work is becoming tougher. So I would just ask that going forward, that when you see the situation, you let us know.
I'd like to just
Go
make
ahead.
a few comments. Lisa, this is amazing. Thank you. Wow, I love it. I think that, what moves me here, I think it's missing a phase, a phase 3, right? So we're analyzing it, we're talking to everybody about it, but then the changes we're making doesn't sound like is missing, right? And the conversation should really be with the workforce that's actually doing it and us that's making that decision, because ultimately they are the workforce is going to tell us, right, why they're leaving the industry, right? And understanding and hearing that and implementing those changes is what's going to be critical in protecting this workforce, because this sector is probably not going away.
No, absolutely.
As the industry, as our housing crisis continues and squeezes people out of their homes. So I think a real conversation about what, with the workers, right? Are we engaged with the social workers union here? Or are they part of the conversation? Like, what can you talk about a little bit about that?
I have not, we have not had direct engagements with the social workers union. We have a representative group across 12 different providers, which is a number of providers across our sector of frontline advisory staff that are the liaisons for their peers. And so we work with that advisory group on a monthly basis. They're actually giving us input, and that's who Corinne has worked with as well. And they've been helping us develop that survey, which will actually be pushed out much broader than that advisory group. It will go out into those agencies. But I'll definitely, yes, would be interested in the social workers union as well.
I think I know that this is being guided by Professor Makapugay. She's an amazing woman. The fact that you spoke about why self-care is more harmful and that we need to transition our thinking away from self-care, because really we have to take care of each other, is a foundational thinking on this. That's, I think, if you view it from that lens, we're gonna make this industry a powerful one, and one that's gonna help a whole lot of people. So I love it. Thank you for this presentation. I learned a lot. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Ditto to the comments that precede mine. Question on the study: are we going to include some of the demographic pieces? I'm going to suspect that the industries we're talking about are largely females working there, or yeah.
It really varies. Particularly when you look into the shelter and the outreach programs, you see a real combination, and you actually see as many males generally as females, just because the environments are different a little bit. So definitely when you go to and we see it in our own teams as well. We see both. We have a pretty broad demographic in regards to who we're employing and who we're seeing as workforce in the sector, but definitely we'll be looking at that as well. And, we cannot talk about this without talking about that equity lens as critical, right? Because, part of lifting people out of poverty is making sure that they have the funds to go beyond just making their basic, rent payments, right? They have the ability to build wealth.
Fantastic. I'm really excited to get this going. I think it's going to be, and hearing, I did see that piece that was in the Voice. I think that this validates that need, and I'm glad that the commission staff has taken this so seriously. I'm only sorry that we weren't aware of the very important work that you were doing with the various contractors and everybody. We should assume that you've got it covered. I have known that the payment points is a point of heartburn, and it's not limited to just industries that have a more challenging work environment, right? I see it with my members all the time, and of course our contractors are dealing with that, and we're probably dealing with it as well. So, or are, as you pointed out. So thank you for this. Thank you for the work you've done to get us to this point, and I'm very excited to see the outcome of that study.